Dear guest, dear panelist, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the fifth episode of the Climate Action Conversation series, How to Build a Just Transition for All. We are honored by your presence and grateful for your participation today. Please note that live translation is available throughout this event. My name is Asma. I'm a project collaborator at the Green Earth Action Foundation. Today, I'm with my colleague Maureen, who will be moderating this session today. To give you an overview of today's session, we will begin with a keynote address by our Jeff Ambassador, Mr. Felix Odiambo Akelo, from the Jeff Ambassador Program 2025 cohort. This will be followed by a panel discussion on just transition with our esteemed panelists. After the panel, we will open the floor for a Q&A where you will have the opportunity to ask your questions. You may submit a question at any time during the session using the Q&A box down below. Before we dive into today's topic, I would like to invite our head of office, Ms. Baptistelle Paldino, to briefly introduce our organization, the Green Earth Action Foundation. Baptistelle, over to you.
Thank you, Asma, for this introduction and a warm welcome to all of you joining us for today's webinar on the topic of just transition, a subject that is especially meaningful as we mark the World Day of Social Justice today. So by a brief way of introduction, the Green Earth Action Foundation is a UNEP-accredited international nonprofit organization based in Geneva, and our mission is to empower young people and communities to drive impactful and sustainable actions. Jeff was founded in 2023 in response to the urgent need for more systemic, inclusive, and forward-looking approaches to the global climate crisis. The Green Earth Action Foundation is guided by the values of the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals. Our mission is to advance sustainability by building environmental awareness and developing the next generation of informed and engaged leaders. So our vision is a world in which communities and ecosystems thrive together, a world where awareness leads to measurable progress and where individuals everywhere are empowered to shape a more sustainable future. To make this vision a reality, we carry out impactful initiatives such as our Jeff Ambassador Program. So each year, this program brings together environmental leaders from all around the world and trains them for more than 6 months in outreach, advocacy, or leadership. In this program, the Jeff Ambassador also designed their own environmental action plan, directly supported and mentored by the Jeff team. We also implement smaller scale awareness initiatives, such as our Climate Action Conversation series, which aims to deepen understanding of climate-related challenges while introducing key concepts and practical tools for effective climate action. If you want to have a look at previous episodes, feel free to visit our website. Now, I would like to thank you all again for joining us today and thank our panelists for attending this Climate Action Conversation series episode. I now have the pleasure of handing over to my colleague Maureen to continue the program.
Thank you, Baptistelle. About today's subject, the world remains off track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But one imperative remains clear. A shift towards a sustainable net zero future is required. However, this transition can only be effective but also durable if it's fair and inclusive. Climate change and its impact are not experienced uniformly. As you all know, they vary significantly across regions, community, livelihoods, and social groups. Ensuring that no one is left behind is therefore central to the credibility and success of climate action. And this resonates even more today as we are on the World Day of Social Justice. Originating in the 1980s within the US trade union movement, the concept of just transition has evolved into a framework aimed at balancing environmental action with social and economic justice. But despite growing global recognition, including its reflection in the Paris Agreement preamble and the recent decision to create the Belém Action Mechanism for Just Transition, of course, there remain challenges in implementation. Before we begin our discussion with our panelists and to help us understand why this concept is central to delivering sustainability in practice and advancing towards a net zero future, we are pleased to welcome GEF ambassadors Felix Odhiambo Akelo. Felix Odhiambo Akelo is an energy planning and resource mobilization officer within the county government of Kisumu in Kenya and serves as the M&E focal point. He sits on the steering committee of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction and the regional steering committee of Connective Cities. He holds a BSc in Environmental Studies and is currently pursuing an MSc in Energy Studies with experience across EU and World Bank supported energy and environment programs. Felix, thank you so much for being here today. Now, over to you.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Jeffkin, and also our listeners out there. It's great to see you here again. My name is Felix Odhiambo Akelo, as has been mentioned by my colleagues. I'm here because I got to know the GF through the ambassador in November, and I went through the process of training and capacity building until we got to the point where now we are here after the graduation. It culminated on 29th of April when you had an event, and the event is largely around the same topic we are discussing today. So I would just like to say that in line with what our colleagues are saying is something that we're linking now what we know of knowledge and education to practice, which is community centered. That is the basic thing that is my driving agenda. Of course, as an ambassador, if we leave alone even the GF, I think what I do globally is to look at policies and cascade them to subnational level. Have been introduced, so that is very much in order. I'll go deep into in terms of just transitions, whereby the talking points are around focusing on inclusive, equitable, and sustainable transitions across sectors and regions. Because I know I do a lot of work in South-South issues, but again, based on what you are hearing, the global ABC, even the connected cities, I know even the UN, I do a lot of work with them, the European Union. The point is you're trying to localize solutions because, again, if you look at the topic here, just transition, then it means that we have a problem already. And the problem we have needs to be solved by practical solutions, which is making justice, because justice basically means you're doing the correct thing with respect to whether it's a human being, an animal, any part of the environment. And transition basically is how you are moving from point A to point B. Our transition basically here is decarbonization and net zero. That is the ambition that we all have around what we're going to be discussing. So in terms of policy approach, I look at sustainability in terms of the just transitions, climate justice, circular economies, zero emission, replication, energy modeling. I know it's might be a new word, but then it's basically using scientific data that is been authenticated and verifiable to be able to project future occurrences or future activities, because that is what will help you know how to plan for adaptation or mitigation projects that are resilient based on realistic demographics. We have the issue of decarbonization and roadmaps, where again now we're talking about the national angle in terms of there's heat action planning, there's green building standards, there's even e-mobility, all those things. Clean cooking again is very busy right now. We have inclusivity, we have integrity, subnational focus. I already mentioned this. Then the key point is you have current global trends and goals that are translating into green jobs and green skills. So that is basically what is happening. I know when you had an event at the JIF last year on 29th April 2025, we trees we were able to engage 60 community members who registered, of course, the people who were passing by. We did this in Kanyaluo, Karachoni, in Homa Bay County in Kenya. That is basically in Africa. Support from the county government of Homa Bay. We had the county government coming in to support us, and also Kisumu, there's water and sanitation, parliament, and health. They also had GIZ, because we're looking at the issue of climate as an inclusive process. Cannot handle this issue alone. We all need to keep working together, different sectors, different institutions, and not even the audience here probably might want to get to know what's going on and just link and get to be part of the process. What we looked at was the possibility of successive annual events after this, which again we are hearing, of course, with another G5 ambassador program, which
Okay, thank you so
what I'm
much,
focusing
Felix.
this year. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Please
Felix, it
continue.
seems like we lost you for a couple of minutes, but you can continue now.
Yes, you can hear me. Great. I know it's a little bit of the network here sometimes. So the whole point is my experience is basically in terms of policy and development around energy issues. Then you're linking energy to environment because you see my undergrad is on environmental sciences, and then the other issues now on the master's is on renewable energy. So you're trying to look at energy as because you talk about decarbonization and now net zero, then you're trying to just ensure that there's clean energy being used across the sectors or departments. What we worked on that was very interesting was development of a heat action plan. We did that with the support of our partners, and we were able to work with another 13 subnationals because I know that's what we're doing. We're trying to link one particular subnational with a number of subnationals so that we have collective action. I know we had a CPOL, they could be represented here. We developed a roadmap towards 100% renewable energy transition up to 2050 for the county. Then this translated to the national, also the policy recommendations. And now we're doing a lot of projects. So this more of like you can showcase that we're actually doing things that can be able to be copied and implemented by other areas. In terms of policy, what I could say is my focus is we're looking at green jobs and the issues with local manufacturing. That's the most important thing because local manufacturing gives people opportunity and across the value chains of what they're doing. And then you're looking at energy as a source of power for productive use. So you want to translate what you're producing or you're using to a few shillings, whether you're just spending and you're saving or you're actually producing power. So that's what brings the justice part of it. I know I'm saying this because you'll see one of the speakers here in the panelists is on labor and ILO. The big thing is how can we do sustainable work in our lives, basically. Then we have the final part of my segment is the global policy landscape. And now I'm looking a lot at the Delhi Amendment, the Montreal Protocol, the Marrakesh Agreement around the Kyoto Protocol. I'm looking at the Rio Declaration, Paris Agreement, and then we have these global and subnational cooling pledges. We have UN missions in terms of mission innovation, efficiency, 300, urban transition. It's all that together because what you're saying is that we're at a point where our professionals and our communities and our projects for natural resources must meet somewhere. And that is where the just transition topic comes. I'll keep reminding us of this so that at least as we move, we understand that it's more of an ecosystem that is circular and everything we're doing is just seamlessly intertwined. Um, the topic today is around SG 8, 12, and 13. And that is where I am. Over to you, Asma. Thank you for listening.
Hey. Thank you so much, Felix. Your experience truly shows that just transition is more than a concept. It is a necessity. I believe your words will strongly resonate with the points our panelists will discuss with us today. And now turning to our panel, it is my pleasure to introduce today's experts. Our first guest for today is Mr. Joshua Deru. Mr. Deru is the Just Transition Lead at the UK Climate Change Committee, focusing on the delivery of an affordable, accessible, and fair transition to a net zero and climate resilient UK. His work covers the impacts of climate change and climate policies on workers, household bills, and the economy, as well as the distribution of costs and benefits and how these affect wider issues such as skills, health, and fuel poverty. It also includes engaging with workers, households, and the most affected communities across the UK to ensure their voices are reflected in CCC advice to the government. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Joshua. Our second guest is Mr. Philip Gass. Mr. Philip Gass is the Director, Energy Program leading Just Transition and Canada work streams. His recent focus has been on the development of fiscal policy approaches that facilitate greenhouse gas mitigations, including carbon pricing and subsidy reform. He also works directly on economic approaches that promote sustainability, including the green economy, circular economy, and just transitions. Internationally and in Canada, his work focuses on the impact of the transition from coal, oil, and gas to renewable energy, ensuring policy plans are equitable and inclusive. He has a background in political economy and stakeholder engagement, having worked in legislative setting in Canada prior to joining IISD. Also joining us today, we have Mr. Jack. Mr. Jack is the program coordinator within the youth program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He specializes in youth-led climate action, air quality advocacy, and environmental justice, with a focus on facilitating equitable and people-centered approaches to socio-economic development and climate initiatives in South Africa. He has practical experience supporting just transition processes through stakeholder engagement and research in South Africa's Code Belt. Additionally, he possesses extensive postgraduate training in multidisciplinary community development and research methodologies. He has also earned a technical certification from the Career Path Development for Employment program, which focuses on technical and vocational education and training, capacity development for just transition, and employment promotion projects. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Jack. And then finally, we have Ms. Alice Vodza, policy specialist and technical experts with nearly 20 years of experience at the intersection of employment creation, skills development, and environmental sustainability. Ms. Alice Vodza currently supports the ILO in operationalizing its just transition mandates, working with institutions and policymakers to design national and sectoral strategies that promote decent work and socio-economic transformation within a sustainability framework. Over the years, she has led and contributed to programs across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, focusing on green enterprise development and the strengthening of skills and lifelong systems. She has managed cross-sector initiatives, advised governments and social partners, strengthened TVET capacities, and delivered technical cooperation projects. Ms. Alice, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Asma, for introducing our panelists. And of course, thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today for this important discussion. Now, let's dive into today's subject. For all of our participants, do not forget to share your question using the Q&A box, and we'll answer all of them right after our panel. To dive into the discussion, I think Felix mentioned in his keynote speech the role of the international community. And in 2015, the ILO guidelines for just transition provides the first comprehensive tripartite agreed framework for integrating decent work, social justice, and environmental and climate action. Mrs. Alice Vodza, could you maybe briefly highlight the main objective and what they seek to achieve? And as we are in 2026, it has been almost 10 years since their issuance. How have you seen the discourse and practice around just transition evolve? And what progress or remaining gaps do you observe today?
Thank you very much. Thank you again for the invitation. Particularly happy to be here on this day, the World Day of Social Justice. And starting with the Just Transition Guidelines, indeed, it was about 10 years ago, October 2015, when they were published. And they did something unique, I would say, in the sense that they brought together environmental sustainability, social justice, and decent work into one coherent policy framework. What was crucial about the Just Transition Guidelines, the full title is Guidelines for a Just Transition Towards Environmentally Sustainable Economies and Societies for All. And every word counts in this long title, in the sense that, first of all, they were agreed in a tripartite way by representatives of governments, employers, and workers around the world. Secondly, they basically recognize the urgency of climate action, of transitioning towards low carbon resilient development. But at the same time, they put forward the decent work agenda into the environmental debate, saying that this transition have to be also economically viable, fair, and inclusive for the workforce, for enterprises, for businesses. They must create decent jobs, reduce inequalities, and address social cohesion. So this set of principles indeed were recognized already in 2015 in the framework of the Paris Agreement. They are referenced in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. And then they provide guidance across key policy areas that at the time were considered priority, including macroeconomic and sectoral policies, skills development and lifelong learning, labor market policies, social protection, social dialogue, and rights at work. What is also important is that they clearly spell out that just transition is no one-size-fits-all model. Every country has to take its own transition pathway. It affects all economic sectors, not exclusively energy or some sectors that have been prioritized, of course, but just transition can happen across the sectors of the economy. And as we say, with different recipes at country level. What has happened since 2015, 10 years after, what do we see? First of all, some good milestones in terms of global recognition. They were formally adopted in 2023 by an International Labour Conference resolution. But also we have seen the developments under the UNFCCC Just Transition Work Programme, the recent decision to establish a Just Transition mechanism. We have seen the declarations of the Just Energy Transition principles in the G20 discussion a couple of years ago. We see the reference to just transition in the Just Energy Transition partnerships, but also more and more in national policies. And this is where I think our discussion pays attention on today. Another milestone was in the growing of our evidence base, and this has not been only the work of the ILO, but of all the international and national partners. We know, for example, very well now the linkages between environmental and labor dimensions. We have global updates on the impact of heat stress on occupational safety and health and productivity. We have annual research telling the numbers of jobs being created in renewables, clean energy, circular economies, nature-based solutions. Currently, they employ about 200 million, according to our recent research. And more we understand the linkages, and also the disconnects, the spatial, temporal, and skills mismatches that can emerge in the transition process. So now that we have gained the momentum, we have enhanced our knowledge base, I think what we have to look at now is what do we do in practice? How can we enhance implementation at country level? Some little progress, and I think we will have time to expand it through the panel discussion. We see some embedding of just transition considerations in climate plans. The nationally determined contributions updated last year are a good reference of how just transition is increasingly reflected into climate commitments. We see also the creation of institutional mechanisms for social dialogue at the national level, increased investments in upskilling, reskilling, and the expansion of social protection systems, for instance, as part of both adaptation and mitigation strategies. Some gaps remain, which would be nice to discuss with my colleagues at the panel in terms of ensuring more coherence and coordination in policy implementation. The big issue of financing a just transition, which is, of course, of great importance to all the countries, and the importance of social dialogue. We have seen growing attention to that. But then when we see at the modalities of engagement, particularly for social partners and other non-state actors, there is still, I think, room for improvement to bring everybody at the table for discussion. So it's not more about why are we discussing just transition, but now the full attention is how do we make it happen and how do we implement at scale in a fair and inclusive way.
Mm-hmm. That is very interesting. Thank you very much for this answer. I think it's very nice to see that there is international framework that exists to help guide countries, which is very important. But we also see other example. For example, we have some countries that use to guide their policy. Example of other countries. This is also sometimes things that we see in certain example. Mr. Deru, the CCC primary role is to advise the UK government on how the UK can reduce its emission and also adapt to climate change. While, of course, this mandate is largely national, you also draw an international example to learn from, but also to benchmark your advice. Could you maybe share how the CCC uses this international experience in practice, and also what type of lessons have been most valuable in shaping or even testing your recommendations?
Oh, yeah, and thanks very much for having me on the call today. Really interesting to hear from everyone. Yeah, as you say, our role is primarily focusing on advising the UK government on its climate targets and to monitor its progress in reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. But there is this really big role for international collaboration and also learning from what people are doing in other countries and at a kind of international level. What we tend to find is that if we have a problem here in the UK, then that problem is also being faced by lots of people around the world, often in advance of what's happening here in the UK. And that sharing our experiences and learning from what other countries are doing is really helpful in understanding how we can best kind of respond to those challenges. One of the main examples in the UK is that we're seeing rising temperatures and extreme heat in the UK. And we can look to other countries who've already kind of adapted to that heat or in the process of doing that. Some of that is technological things like which types of cooling material or what type of building materials are working well. Some of that is societal things like which hours of the day people are working, and some of that is regulation. So what types of building standards do you want to have in place, or what workplace temperature regulations do you need? And we can look to both the kind of international frameworks, things like the ILO, but also to specific countries and their governments. And in particular, we find it's quite helpful to think about how people have considered fairness within the country and things like this. So things like disability, age, or income inequality, so that we can make sure that the actions that we're recommending to the government have these considerations built in from the start. And so what we'll often do is speak to these other organizations and climate councils and gather kind of information, and then we'll use that to inform our government and hopefully share that back to other groups around the world. And as you mentioned, we also use these to kind of directly benchmark our data and analysis. So when we're looking, for example, at how fast we think we can roll out electric heating in the UK, we've been looking at other countries and how they've rolled this out so far. So some countries in Scandinavia, for example, are quite far along in this transition to electric heating. And so we can look at how quickly they've managed to scale up new technologies and jobs and supply chains to make sure that this is a good transition, a fair transition, and also to make sure that we're proposing something that's realistic and that we can say, you know, when people come to us and say that's not possible, this is too fast or too far, we can say, actually, look, there's other countries who've already done this, they've done this well, here are some things we can learn, but they're a kind of good example in place. I guess the final thing is it's not just about kind of us learning from others, but also trying to share that back with other people, those who are interested in what we've gathered. And we work with the International Climate Councils Network, which is a group of similar councils around the world. And anyone basically who wants to work with us, we will share information. And that's also through PACT, which is the Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions program. And we've been working with friends in Indonesia, in Nigeria, Colombia, Mexico, and I think Malaysia recently. All of that to share our learnings in terms of some of the data, some of the modeling we're doing, but also what we're finding works here and doesn't work as well. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for this answer. Through these two answers, we looked at international framework, but also how can countries basically work together and inspire themselves into policies, technologies, and other things as such. But in the last few years, we also have seen some countries, for example, in the United States, where we have seen a renewed wave of support for reviving industries like, for example, coal mining. Oftentimes, these sectors tend to view transition to a greener economy and more sustainable energy sources almost as a threat. We have seen that in many communities where coal mining was the main source of income, closure have led to significant job losses, economic hardship, population decline, and with, of course, broader impacts on, for example, local commerce and so on. Mr. Philip Gas, how do you respond to these concerns, and how can a just transition address the needs of these communities specifically?
Thanks for inviting me today. I'm happy to speak a little bit about this, and it's good to hear from the others as well. I'll start addressing this question by noting I started working on just transition in 2016. This issue at the time really started to heat up in the United States at that time in regards to the election going on then. One of the key observations I had was that you can have the best just transition plan in the world, but if the other side is just saying, well, I'll keep the coal mines open, it's a very appealing message because you get to keep what you have, which is a better alternative to something new and unknown. I think at the end of the day, there was a big communications issue as to a big communications problem, and also that environment and labor were frankly pitted against each other a little bit over the course of over that election. And at the end of the day, it ended up being a bit of a smoke and mirrors. There was a story I actually shared with you earlier this week that shows that the number of coal mine closures happening over the past, over the Trump presidency was higher than any other previous presidency. And so the message ended up not being true, but people believed it. We want to believe these things, that these sectors can continue. Look, you need to have concrete answers for workers. You need to speak their language. You need to do more listening than speaking. I mean, in many cases, it's an issue of livelihoods, of feeding families. It's not like these workers don't care about the environment or climate change, but the issue of reducing emissions and climate change is a level at sort of the 30,000 foot level. The ability to pay to put food on the table is one that's at the 6 foot level. It's at the level of the families. So it's about understanding and making the case that this transition is about it is also more economically driven than climate change driven. As new energy technologies become cheaper, including renewable energy, but also even frankly, natural gas, coal is becoming less economically competitive, and holding back this competitiveness edge for these new technologies is like trying to hold back an ocean wave with your hands. There are ways that you could potentially subsidize industries to keep them open longer, but that the transition is going to happen. Think of the similar technologies, the way that automobiles overtook horse-drawn vehicles, or cellular telephones took over wired communications lines, and streaming services overtook video rental stores in North America and Europe. Technology changes happen, and we can prepare for them. Where just transition can come in, provided it's done in a tripartite plus manner, working with employers and workers and other stakeholders, is that we can identify and offer supports to people who are affected by transition. Retraining and setting up workers for jobs in new and growing sectors is important, and ensuring that there is funding and support for these programs during transition is really critical, so that we ensure families are taken care of. A big part of it is building up social safety nets so that unemployment supports and other worker transition are in place. But most of all, just transition programming has to be developed and implemented in this tripartite manner, which means that you're not consulting workers. The workers are part of helping to design and implement the policies. They aren't subject to them. They're not subject to a just transition plan. They're part of building the just transition plan, working with the environmental groups. And this helps diffuse some of the opportunity for these groups to be put at odds with each other. When at the end of the day, I think everybody has the same goals. It's just that, as I said, these transitions are new and unknown. They create uncertainty, and we have to all ensure that we're working in the same direction together.
Mm-hmm. And talking about the importance of having communities part of the planning of this type of policies, I think about a different type of context. For example, in the Global South, we see that a large share of the workforce is employed, but mostly in the informal sector, meaning that there are workers that are often not covered by labor legislation, income taxation, even social protection systems. And we also see that women and youth are frequently overrepresented in this category. But how can you have just transition policies that ensure that this specific population are not negatively affected by the transition, and what tools or policy measure can be put in place to protect and support informal workers?
It's absolutely a major challenge. So I would say two things. I mean, first, in speaking with a number of labor-focused NGOs and other bodies, that they do try to look out for informal workers, even if they aren't formally unionized or in formalized labor sectors. This is something to keep in mind, that there are a lot of labor groups that should be part of Just Transition that do help to represent those rights of those workers who are informal. And we should be working with them and ensuring that they're part of these processes as well. But it's not the same as for formal workers. I certainly admit, and that the rights that they have are not the same. The second, I would say, and you speak about women and youth, and I also think about other community members as well, and disadvantaged communities. When we deal with an issue of like coal phase out, for example, it's not just coal miners, it's not just people working in coal-fired power plants who are affected, it's entire communities. It's hospitals, it's schools, it's shopkeepers, and it's other people working in the economy that if that coal mine closes, their customer base leaves, and you can't run your shop because you don't have any customers anymore. And so I think that to come back to what I was saying about the tripartite plus model of policy development and implementation, it's so important to have these other stakeholders as part of this discussion. And that plus is not just something added on the end. It's essential because everybody is affected by these just transitions, because they also represent the interests of informal workers, of women's groups, of community groups, of consumers associations, of youth, and that we have to ensure that that we all look at this in terms of a concrete way, that researchers like ourselves try to look at this. And the research and engagement that we're doing has to be more inclusive. We can't. We certainly have to speak with and partner with workers, but we can't stop there. We need to look at whole communities, and we also need to look at how people are affected. A lot of modeling in economic modeling in the climate change space looks at GDP and emissions, and everything is GDP emissions, GDP emissions. And so one of the things that we're trying to do at IISD is looking at this through a bit more of a socially focused lens, because what do GDP and emissions mean to workers? I mean, GDP is the highest level economic indicator there is. It's not jobs. It doesn't measure affordability. It doesn't measure energy access or employment or gender equity or social inclusion. Including some of these indicators in the analysis that we're doing, informing those tripartite processes is really important. And that's one of the things that IISD is looking to do through some of our work, and becoming a key part of our work is embedding that whenever we're doing policy analysis or advice or economic modeling or emissions modeling, is that we're making our energy research more applicable and relevant to those who are impacted by transition, and also more available and accessible to them as well, so that those groups can then use it in their own advocacy with governments. And so saying that, look, if you close this coal mine, it's going to have differentiated impacts on gender, on social income groups. And it's not just, well, the emissions will go down and the GDP will be affected. It looks at it from a much more holistic manner.
Thank you so much for this answer. Now, if we zoom in even more on a specific national context, Mr. Jack, you are joining us from South Africa, which is a country who has been moving pretty steadily toward a low carbon and climate resilient economy, if we look at it through the lens of just transition. In 2022, President Ramaphosa established the Presidential Climate Commission, which adopted South Africa's just transition framework. Now, more than 4 years on, what are the key takeaways, particularly regarding community level participation, coordination between local and national governments, and implementation or even execution on the ground?
Thanks, Marie. Yeah, I'd say since 2022, when they enacted the Just Transition framework or plan, we were looking at advancing the just transition through three justices. So firstly, we're looking at procedural justice. How are we communicating or engaging with the communities around the just transition itself, the role they play, how they can be involved in planning and implementation processes, and then also looking at distributional justice. So are the benefits, challenges going to be shared equitably around these different stakeholder groups that play in the ecosystem as well? And then also looking at distributive justice, which speaks to addressing previous imbalances or unfair practices in those communities. So I think in that context, some of the key takeaways largely stem around procedural justice. So in my experience, when we've done stakeholder engagement initiatives, it was mostly centered around consultation fatigue or stakeholder engagement fatigue, whereby we'd get most communities telling us that we've been consulted before. People have come to us in the name of awareness raising or training us around what the just transition actually means, and also just seeing how they can develop a common vision for the future for the just transition for South Africa. But then that's been duplicated so many times. So when we actually go into communities, they feel like it's essentially uh, uh, I'd say useless for lack of a better word, but yeah, it's also just seeing how we can move away from awareness raising and training and actually involving them in the co-creation of solutions going forward and capacitating them with the skills to make their initiatives or proposed solutions bankable and feasible as well. And then I think something else that's been touched on is the inclusion gap. In most cases, when we're also doing these stakeholder and community engagement processes, we'll find that most women, youth, and also people living with disabilities aren't included as much. So there's a significant gap that's been highlighted as well through these multiple years since we've been looking at the just transition. So it's seeing how we can expand our reach into these hard to reach communities and also making sure that we cover that knowledge gap and even language barrier gap, as in South Africa we have 12 official languages, so you can imagine how difficult it is to actually raise awareness around the just transition in those local contexts using those local languages. And yeah, it's really tough around that. So it's just navigating that context. And then also just moving away from awareness raising. I think we've done enough since 2022. Now we think we need to move into co-creation and actually getting solutions that have been offered to actually get to implementation. But then there lies a significant gap where most communities or environmental groups even can't even access funding, since it's such a rigid and bureaucratic process whereby you'll find that most aren't even experienced in grant making or proposal development writing. So it's just also feeding into that. And then in terms of coordination between local government and national, we'll find that the Presidential Climate Commission, which sits in the presidency of our country, would set out these different policies like the Just Transition Framework. But then when it gets down to local, you'll find that most municipal officials aren't even conscientized appropriately regarding that. So, and then they also face a challenge whereby, okay, it sounds nice on paper. We have these formal structures and mechanisms, but then where's the funding coming from? And then you'll find that there'll be a tug of war between actually implementing service delivery and then also looking at climate change initiatives or just transition initiatives. So yeah, it's those nuances around that. And then I think lastly, in terms of implementation and execution on the ground, we're largely dealing with an issue of accessing climate finance, especially for communities and NGOs. Do we have appropriate resources or support structures in our local communities where they would guide these different people or groups in terms of accessing climate funding? So looking at the ideas, so taking them from awareness raising, conceptualization, and also proposal writing, and then also getting to a point where these ideas or solutions are actually bankable and feasible. So that's been a significant gap or issue that still needs to be addressed because we don't necessarily have permanent say spaces or departments that would offer support like that to communities that have been engaged so far. Meanwhile, we do have the Just Transition Project Management Unit, which does provide services in relation to that, but then in most cases, there's not enough support for people to actually access this funding. And then, yeah, I think lastly, it's just making sure that we don't have once-off engagements where we're building a progression, where we're building social trust and license with these communities, because in most cases, we might get funding for initiatives that are only based on raising awareness or doing skills development, and then we just cut off contact. So we essentially eroding the trust we've been building with communities, and then the next group is going to come along and do the same thing. So I guess this is a question to the funders themselves in terms of the scope of work that they're putting forward in the ecosystem, and then just seeing how we progress from there. Thanks.
No, thank you to you. And actually talking about, the communities, so we've seen with Mr. Philip Gass, how important is it to have the communities involved in actually making the policy so they are not just a subject to it, but also really actors on it. But then I also hear you on the other side talking about stakeholder fatigue, the knowledge gap, etc. So my follow-up question would be, how can we really ensure that communities are consulted, but also actively involved in the planning process to have basically a great result in the end and great effect on these communities?
Yeah, I think to Philip's previous point around policy formulation, as well as let's start early, let's involve them before these policies get finalized or being offered. So from that inception phase, let's get to talking with them and actually draft these policies that are going to speak to the local realities and actually make sense to them. And even the priorities that are being addressed in these policies should actually speak to our local context. I think that's one. And then also, like I said, just moving from awareness raising to now co-developing solutions and getting them to implementation. And then thirdly, also just using accessible and inclusive engagement methods. So let's also look at creative ways of how to engage these different stakeholder groups. So from your elderly to affected workers and also maybe unemployed youth in our communities. Let's see how we can creatively engage with people and then just taking that scientific terminology or jargon into local realities or local language and seeing how we can bridge that gap. And then also, I think from my community development expertise, I'd say just look at existing structures and resources. Let's see what platforms exist that we can use to push the agenda forward and also drive just transition processes rather than starting all over again, so wasting more time. So let's rather just use existing assets and platforms. And then also just building feedback mechanisms, because in most cases when we're doing just transition interventions, we go there with our scope or mandate, and then in most cases we never go back or give feedback, even though we would say that in the engagements that, okay guys, we've engaged with you, we've spoken about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you've given us these interventions, but then there's that lack in monitoring and evaluation and learning. So it's something that also needs to be looked at. And then I'd say, lastly, it's just institutionalizing participation. So we've had the Climate Change Act recently, which was enacted, I think, in 2024, which also provides a mandate for community members or the public as a whole to hold these different stakeholders accountable for their actions and to get to a point where they'll be able to veto decisions that are made that are going to affect them ultimately. So it's making them aware of those different platforms that exist and also their constitutional rights. So I think that'll aid in the fight.
Thank you so much for this answer. I think it's very interesting to see how context relevant all of the discussion are. Now, if we remove context and look at another example, since the 1990s, the UK has made quite steady progress on decarbonization. Greenhouse gas emissions have more than halved since the 1990s, and the pace of reduction has accelerated significantly since the introduction of the UK Climate Change Act in 2008. From your perspective, Mr. Joshua Deru, what is the UK's current situation today, and what are the main challenges and constraints to maintaining or even accelerating this trajectory in the coming years?
Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And for any interested listeners, we do publish an annual report on this, so we monitor the government's progress and kind of write to Parliament on how we think they're doing. I think the short answer is that there's been some good progress and we've seen some good change, but there's still a lot more to do. And as you said, emissions have halved since 1990, and they're reducing both in terms of the UK's territorial emissions and its total emissions when you consider things like imports and international aviation and shipping. But that definitely doesn't mean we're anywhere near done yet. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing at the moment is that over the next kind of decade or so, the focus of the decarbonisation will shift in terms of the sectors we're looking at. So for the past 15 years or so, it's mostly been about decarbonising our energy supply. So moving away from coal and gas now, and the rollout of kind of renewable energy sources like offshore wind and solar. But in the coming years, what we really need to start looking at is decarbonisation of the other sectors. So buildings, people's homes, how we heat our homes, how we travel and what we drive, for example, and then eventually things like agriculture, nature and aviation. And last year we did an assessment of the government's plans, and we found that about 61% of the required reductions in emissions to hit our 2030 target are covered by kind of credible plans or has some smaller risks, whereas the other 39% has quite significant risks or insufficient plans currently. And the biggest risks are around heating, so how we roll out heat pumps and things like industrial electrification. And the biggest challenge, unsurprisingly, here is that a lot of these things are now more to do with people's day-to-day lives. So, what their energy bills are, how they travel. And to do that, we need to make sure that we get this just transition, one that's affordable, it's accessible, attractive, and fair. And we've done some analysis that shows that in the longer term, we know that lots of these changes will bring benefits to most people. For example, the average household in 2050, if we get to net zero, should have energy bills around £700 lower and transport costs about £700 lower as well. But what we need to do is make sure that people are actually feeling that sooner and can feel that now, and that people have the right incentives and also the right upfront support to change, because, changing your heat pump can mean lower bills in the future, but you need to have the access to the capital and you need to be able to kind of have the right installers and the money up front to pay for some of these things. And that's where government support can step in. And as part of that, our top recommendation to government last year was to make electricity cheaper. And we'll be publishing another report this summer, which says how well we think they've done. And the second kind of big challenge is one that some of the guests have already spoken about today, but is on jobs and communities. We know that workers in oil and gas in the UK and around the world are in these kind of high carbon industries, but are going to be a really important part of this transition. And governments need to be involving them in developing these plans, and also not just being reactive, but being proactive. So one of the biggest challenges we see is that often governments will do something like waiting for a factory to be about to close before coming up with a plan for building jobs in the future. But what we need is this proactive sight of, we know that these industries will have to transition over the next 20, 30 years. What can we do to make sure that these good jobs are in place in the right area and with the right kind of skill levels for the people who want to move into them before these industries are impacted? And the Scottish Government recently has been working with the Just Transition Commission in Scotland here to develop some national frameworks and kind of monitoring to make sure this is happening. But we know there's still quite a lot of action needed across the UK and around the world on these issues. So I'd say those are the two main issues. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think hearing your answer, but also thinking about what Mr. Jack has said on the specific context of South Africa, I think it's very interesting to see that these are two very different contexts. There's a lot of differences, but also some common points, for example, with the role of communities, etc. But as discussed, of course, we kind of see when listening to both of you that just transition requires action, at the global level. However, really effective implementation really depends on tailoring measures to national circumstances, and I think in many cases to actually really specific local and regional context, especially like, for example, a place where there's a lot of coal mining would need specific policies, specific help for just transition. So turning back to you, Mrs. Alice Vota, how can we strike the right balance between having global framework and locally adapted approaches, and how can the international community best support countries in developing but also implementing their own just transition measures?
Thank you. Very interesting to see also the reflections from different countries and how this just transition concept is being localized. So I would say, first of all levels of interventions are required. So we tend to say that just to advance a just transition, we need to work simultaneously at the global, national, subnational, and even sectoral and company level. And as you can see, there could be very different levels of intervention. So first of all, at the global level, global action is important because it creates not only the momentum, but it creates agreement on principles. So having global resolutions and principles and guidelines adopted, it aligns countries at least on the understanding of the concept, what we mean by just transition, what are the guiding principles that should be promoted. In the context of the ILO, this is particularly important because when we adopt a global resolution, is adopted in a tripartite way, which means that it doesn't not inform only governments, but also action for social partners. And when this agreement is achieved globally, even if it's on general principles, it has more chances to be then taken to the country level. So it ensures ownership as well. It's been important over the years to have a global agreement also on a common language and on concepts that needed to be unpacked. So global research is also important to generate evidence that describes the contents and how they're understood in the global level. And then it creates a platform for cooperation. We see how important it is. We have heard about issues of finance, of technical cooperation, how to facilitate knowledge sharing across countries. So this can all be facilitated through the global level. But then when it comes to implementation, that belongs to the national level and below that as well. So let me give you a few examples. Definitely South Africa, interesting to hear your reflection on the just transition framework. And I fully understand the challenges as well. Let me, however, say that this is the first and up to now unique example of a national adaptation of the just transition guidelines. It's been very interesting to follow the work that the government, the PCC, and many other stakeholders have done in the country to say, okay, from the global guidelines, how do we establish a national framework? And we are seeing now, particularly after the adoption of the third generation of NDCs, that some other countries are going through the same trajectory. Or how do we domesticate these guidelines in the country context? So this is important to make sure the just transition is connected to national development priorities. Then there is also at the national level the importance of having sound evidence and research and diagnostics on the real impact. So very often we look at the global report, but then they don't mean much for a country if figures at the global level are aggregated or show maybe major disparities across regions. So if we look into renewables or into critical minerals or into nature-based solutions, we really need to translate what does it mean in terms of job creation, occupational changes, skills mismatches, and at the local level and in the country context. So enhancing research at the national level, I think, is very crucial. Social dialogue, and allow me to unpack a bit social dialogue. Okay, from an ILO perspective, social dialogue is a tripartite, is government, employers, and workers. The Just Transition Guidelines acknowledge the importance of other stakeholders' engagement as well. These platforms have to be institutionalized at the country level. We see increasingly examples of either national or subnational or sectoral forums that are institutionalized to discuss specific just transition issues. We see it in the context of coal regions, for example, but also when it comes to establishing even sector skills bodies in sectors that are critical to the just transition, in the energy sector, to establish what are the priorities for curricula development and review and for a better understanding of the labor demand. So this institutional anchoring at the national level and the institutionalization of dialogue is absolutely crucial to make just transition happen. There are two other levels that I think are important to mention. The subnational one, because we've seen very often that keeping the dialogue only at the national level doesn't resolve the underlying issues that we have in communities, in vulnerabilities, when we talk about exposure to specific risks and climate changes. We see that some vulnerabilities are more present in specific provinces, localities. So bringing this then down to the subnational level, it's absolutely important. An example is given by the Just Energy Transition partnerships, where we see that we are exploring specific value chains that can be unlocked in different localities, and therefore the platform for discussions need to be created in those spaces. And finally, at company level and sectoral level, very often we see that adopting and designing measures is more effective if we take it from a sectoral perspective, or if we talk about very specific measures in terms of occupational safety and health, social protection, social insurance, or skilling, upskilling, reskilling, very often these are effectively designed at the level of sectors and companies. And the role of private sector in implementing these measures is also very crucial. One element that I also want to bring to the table is the dimension of regions in the context, for example, of regional economic communities. It was interesting to observe regions like SADC in Southern Africa that have designed SADC level strategies, for example, on TVET reforms and skills with an angle and a pillar on just transition. So having also these spaces among countries that share similar goals and similar challenges is often important because it allows also cooperation at sub-regional level in the context of structural transformation or economic reforms that countries are discussing. So this is how we see, the flow that should naturally happen from the global to the local level in unpacking solutions and understanding at each level how can we make a meaningful contribution.
Thank you so much for this answer. I think it's really interesting also to see the link in between the level. We talk about subnational, national, but also international level, and to see kind of like the dialogue that is going on in between the communities, in between the national policies, etc. I think this is very nice to get to learn. You mentioned South Africa a few times in your answer, and I think this is a really interesting context, a really interesting example. According to the World Bank, this country is among one of the most unequal countries in the world. And this situation is also compounded by persistently high unemployment, particularly, I think, among young people, with youth unemployment estimated to reach as high as 62%, which is extremely high. In this context, a just transition can feel maybe a bit daunting, a bit complicated. However, we have also seen in the literature that just transition can be presented as a way to also reconcile development priorities and climate action, meaning that just transition as a pathway towards reducing poverty, create decent jobs, and supporting inclusive economic and social development. Mr. Jack, do you share this view? And if so, under what condition could a just transition deliver these outcomes?
Yeah, I do agree with this position. So I think for the first condition, it would be going to a point where we're reframing the discussion as moving from coal-powered energy to renewables only, and also just adding that framing of economic diversification, because when we go into communities and start speaking about the just transition, they just start thinking about the job losses that are going to come with it. But also it's us having I'd say the mindfulness to mention that it's not only a process whereby people are just going to be taken from a certain technical sector to another one. It's also broadening the diverse economic livelihood opportunities that could come with shifting away from carbon emitting sectors. So, for examples, we could look into manufacturing, agriculture, and also decentralized power generation as well. I think it's conscientizing people around those elements and also making sure that we're moving into a localized industry. So when we're shifting, it's going to come with a lot of opportunities, especially in the EV sector and also looking at critical minerals. I think as we're shifting now, we're seeing so many opportunities in solar PV and also battery chemicals. As South Africa, we do possess a lot of competitive advantage in terms of our resources. So when we're looking at PGMs, copper, vanadium, it's also just seeing how we can build our own capacity to beneficiate these critical minerals and ensuring that these jobs stay within our country rather than relying to external partners or countries. And then I think second to that, it's a point on skills development. So are we getting our youth and disadvantaged populations or groups and also affected workers ready for the shift from coal to renewable energy? And I think we've gone we're doing good so far because we're doing so many initiatives that are centered around TVET colleges, and then also just providing affected workers with these technical skills of how they can adapt their existing skills to renewable energy sectors. So like Alice was saying, I think I was also a part of a program that she also gave a module on with the CPD4E initiative that was being implemented by GIZ. So it was around doing a skills transfer and then showing these different elements to the just transition and how people can push their livelihoods or access livelihood opportunities from that. And then also, I think it's just promoting social ownership in these livelihood opportunities. So, like I think I mentioned before, are we training them enough? Are we giving them platforms for them to take their own ideas from being just abstract ideas towards bankable and feasible livelihood proposed solutions that could actually work in their communities given the existing resources or even assets? So I think it's largely around that, and then just also always ensuring that they have the appropriate support mechanisms. So from government, looking at industry players as well, are they given enough opportunities to participate in these processes? And then are they being made aware of also these different opportunities that come with the transition? Because in most cases, it's always it's essentially once-off engagements. So it's just keeping that existing engagement and making it consistent. So I think around those conditions, that's how we can push it forward now. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you so much for this answer. I think we've mentioned quite a lot about South Africa, which is a really interesting context to study. Now turning our focus to another country, but also part of the BRICS. Mr. Gas, you participated to a publication titled Coal Transition Impact and Approach to Inclusive Just Transition Policies in Indonesia, published by IISD last December. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about your key research findings and maybe share any lesson that other countries might draw from Indonesia experience in managing their own transition?
Sure, thank you. This research project ties back to my argument about making modeling and research more relevant for those affected by transitions in both the direct and indirect sectors, and both formal and informal workers that are impacted by energy transition. For example, in our qualitative research, we found that almost 60% of respondents were informal workers, and the sectors with the highest informal employment included food and beverage services and retail, which are generally favored for people because there's low barriers to entry. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, these are also sectors that are affected by energy transition. The research presents an economic analysis of the impact of coal mine closures on sectors linked to coal mining. So coal mining, but what sectors are linked to coal mining. And we took a scenario-based approach to look at potential shocks to economic output and employment. The losses are then sought to be replaced by new industries within the green economy, and taking a very broad look at that, not just saying, for example, renewable energy replaces coal, but what are the other green sectors that might emerge? And the situation is assessed for potential economic employment and other improvements that could be achieved through this transition. We're looking then to provide a picture of what might be expected and how to prepare for it. Now, some of our key recommendations included more traditional findings like the need for reskilling and diversification, which we've already talked about a little bit today, and the need for stronger social safety nets. But we also went more broadly and found a need for mainstreaming things like gender equity and social inclusion within energy policies, which doesn't happen much, but also interministerial collaboration for gender responsive energy planning, bringing together a number of sectors like labor and ones delivering social services along with energy and mineral resource sectors that traditionally don't look at those sorts of indicators. To my point earlier, we also found that while our quantitative modeling was able to pull out significant useful information related to potential employment impacts of coal mine transition, it was less able to produce really relevant gender and social inclusion impacts. And as a result, the modeling exercise was useful, but incomplete. Models can be tailored for GESI-focused coal transition assessments in Indonesia, but at the current state, approaches in the sector lack the sufficient detail for comprehensive just transition and GESI analysis. And this is also why we paired this with a lot of qualitative research approaches as well, and interviews and focus groups and those sorts of things. It's an area for future growth, but it also indicates we continue to need these mixed methods approaches where we do the modeling, we try to make the modeling better, but we also need to meet with the communities. We need to have interviews and surveys and focus groups, and we can't rely on quote unquote numbers to solve all of the problems. Related to this study, we did another one in South Africa that I'll just mention briefly because it talked about this qualitative approach. And we talked earlier about the burnout of engagement and people feeling like they're being talked to. And so what we found there was we adopted more of an ethnographic research approach to engagement where we embedded people. We would look at the idea of embedding people in communities for a long time to observe, to build trust, to build and to meet the community at their level a little bit more, which is seen as more meaningful, both in general, but also where a government or another body or a private sector has come in and held a 2-hour session saying we're engaging people on this new mine or on closing the mine, and then you leave. Whereas we found that builds a lot of resentment and builds a lack of trust. And so when you try to repair that, embedding over a very long period of time and making the effort to show that you want to really meaningfully engage the community is another aspect of it. So to summarize, to what we really learned is that we need both these quantitative and qualitative methods. We need to make the quantitative ones better, but they're not a replacement for actual qualitative research and engagement methods.
Thank you so much for this answer. And the study is extremely interesting. So I encourage everyone to go and have a look at it. You can find it on the IISD website. So feel free to have a look at it. I think today we've discussed a lot about community, a lot about specifically coal community. So we discussed about relation to workers, employment, etc. However, I think just transition also has important implication for household and the energy system, particularly in relation to issues such as energy affordability and fuel poverty, which is something that all of us are implied in it. So, Mr. Joshua Deru, could you maybe explain how the CCC approaches the really household dimension of a just transition and what type of measure or policy packages are needed to ensure that the transition reduces rather than actually worsen, for example, fuel poverty?
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. And I think the way we approach this is quite similar to the way we think about workers and employment. And Mr. Jack spoke about the principles of a just transition, whether that's distributive, redistributive, or participating. And Mr. Gass and Ms. Soto also spoke about kind of the need to combine sort of numbers with real life experience. And so we kind of try to address this in a few ways. One thing is that we do model the kind of distributional impacts quite a lot. So when we're looking at recommending measures to government, we look at what impact this will have, not just for the average household, but for different types of household. And what we do is we break the UK building stock, for example, into about 10,000 different types of house that represent the UK. And we model what types of energy technology they might be able to take up, what types of behavioral change we think is possible in those buildings and with those types of households based on their income, their age, based on how big the house is, how fuel efficient it is. And then we also provide kind of representative 15 of these to represent the main types of impact that we present to government. And there are specific requirements for bodies in the UK like us to think about inequality in terms of things like age, in terms of gender, race, disability. And so we try to use that to inform our recommendations to the government in terms of both what the risks are here and also how we can take action now to improve outcomes for these groups based on that evidence. And the second thing is that we try to look at wider impacts beyond just costs. So we look at air quality, we look at health, we look at things like congestion, productivity, and we say beyond just the direct financial impacts, what benefits and potential costs are there for households, and how can we try and make sure that we maximize the benefits and minimize the risks and look at who is benefiting and who is at risk. And the final thing, as the other panelists have spoken about, is participatory and kind of involvement in the process. And we do try to ensure that households are kind of involved in co-creating policies. One of the things we do is we run citizens panels. So we bring together people from across the UK to discuss policy and kind of provide recommendations to the government. And some of the ways we try to address some of the kind of accessibility issues are firstly, we pay people for their time and for their travel to join us. And we make sure the group represents the UK in terms of demographics. And then we also try to ensure that the voices and opinions shared with us are directly kind of clearly laid out in terms of how that feeds into our final recommendations to government. Some examples of this are, we present independent data to them on climate change, climate policies, and we discuss over a period of multiple sessions what this might mean for people. And then we ask people what they think of these things, what would need to be done for them to agree that this is affordable, that it's accessible, attractive, and fair. And we present draft policy packages. So we say, here are some options that we think might work. What do you think of these? Which bits do you like? Which bits don't you like? And at the end of that, we also get them to try and pull together a policy package based on what the citizens involved in the panel think is right. So we'll present a few policy packages to government that says, here are some options, here is what the public thinks of them, here is what they would do if they kind of constructed their own policy package. Obviously, there are lots of diverse voices within the panel, so it's difficult to get one simple kind of policy option, but we try and indicate which things are, universally popular, which things some people like, some people don't, and we try and differentiate between them. And all of this kind of together allows us to provide some principles to government. We're not policy prescriptive in the sense that it's up to the government to, make and write the policies themselves, but we showcase what it means for different types of people, what different types of people think about these policies and how these impact overall things. I think just to kind of finally close, some of the main examples, there are some obvious things like we need to make electricity cheaper. We have really high electricity prices in the UK. Some of this is to do with the way we structure our energy markets and the policy costs we put on our bills. So we have recommendations to do that as a kind of universal move. There's also a need for upfront support for people to switch to low carbon heating, because this is the biggest kind of additional upfront cost that people will face. So both grants and access to loans for people. And finally, kind of public investment in things like public transport, public charging points for electric cars, to make sure that when people do take these things up, that they are available and accessible to people. And then targeted support. So what our analysis tends to do is identify specific types of household that might need the most targeted support, whether that's people on low incomes, disabled people, but also technological things like some people live in buildings that can't have a heat pump or can't charge their car at home. So they might need different types of policy in place to think about that. That's quite a quick run through of the different things we do. And I'm sure we have a lot more to learn in terms of how we do this, but this is kind of how we start to think about the kind of distributional and just transition element of this for households. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this answer. I think it was extremely interesting to see kind of like the dialogue in between the different contexts. We discussed a lot about South Africa, we discussed about UK, Indonesia, even the US. And I think it was really nice to see basically that at the center of it, we always have this community, the need to include communities in all policies and in all decision, but also to see the differences in between the context and so on, and how each country, its subnational level kind of deals with it. I think to close this panel, I would have a last question for Mrs. Alice Vodza. In December 2025, the ILO published a second mapping on how just transition and related consideration are integrated into the latest generation of climate commitments. I think looking ahead and in the current context, how can countries be supported in making their commitments actually actionable?
Thanks for mentioning also this global mapping. Indeed, it's the second time that we ran it, and we have taken stock of 123 countries that have submitted their updated NDCs in the context of the COP last year. And the good news is to see that 79% of these commitments make explicit reference to just transition in their text, which is a major improvement from the previous mapping, which showed about 50%. And it's meaningful references. It's not just a small reference, but some of these documents include detailed sections on how just transition should be articulated in the context of climate commitments. Also, just to note that almost 90% make reference to employment. So just to flag how visible is now the linkage between the climate action and impact on labor markets. So the first thing is to support countries in their efforts to translate these commitments into specific measures. So we have observed several countries already taking a look at the linkages between climate legislations and labor laws and see what type of adjustments need to be made. between climate legislation and industrial policies. We've seen the evolution of countries. Let me refer, for example, to the Philippines over the years. I think they also were among the first countries to have green, at the time it was called Green Jobs Act, that was adopted in 2019. And it really focused in the beginning on job creation, but it became a sort of enabler of social dialogue and policy coherence in the country, where we've seen that under that framework, the country has taken a thorough review of their human resource and skills development strategies and plans at the country level. They have been in a position to discuss and design some targeted fiscal, non-fiscal incentives for enterprises, and particularly SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And they have, over the years, operationalized the discussion at country level on the governance of climate action. So these are examples of how broad commitments can be translated into specific policy measures. There is a strong call for coherence. We have discussed a lot skills today. There is no point in promoting skilling and upskilling or reskilling if there is no support to job creation and to enterprise and business development, because we cannot just generate the skills. We need to ensure that there is a response to the demand from employers that can provide job opportunities. And we see how social protection, for example, that initially has been seen particularly as a response to mitigation measures, for example, in the phasing down of coal and fossil fuels. How do we support through social protection schemes workers that are at risk? But actually, social protection can be a very important dimension of adaptation strategies as well, to build more resilience among communities. So finding these synergies among policies and facilitating interministerial discussions, I think, is crucial. We cannot work on just transition in silos. It has to be really a whole of a government approach, and of course with the participation of non-state actors as well. There is, of course, an important role for the international community to also support the whole dimension of how to finance a just transition, and how countries can mobilize financing through domestic resources, through international resources. Is not only through climate funding, but it's really also through national resources. There is a need of mind shift, let's say, which is seeing the social dimension of just transition not really as a cost, but as an investment, and how actually investing in social goals and social objectives can help even can make economic sense in the medium to long term. So we advocate for considering skills, protection, and labor market policies really an investment into long-term development strategies. And finally, of course, international cooperation. There is a lot of discussion on how the international community can also facilitate more and more cooperation and country-to-country exchanges. There is a lot of learning that we see that can happen in a form of peer learning across different countries, and through the various multilateral processes and discussions that we are all involved in. So I think it's a mix of different recipes and interventions that can be promoted at the international level, but need really to find a solid entry point and anchoring in the national context.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think this feels like the perfect way to conclude our panel. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for your thoughtful contribution, but also insightful answer. I think throughout our discussion, we covered many important points, and I'm sure there's many of you that have questions. So now over to my colleague Asma for the Q&A portion.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists. Yes, we have received many questions and we will try our best to take just a few. However, if you would like to submit a question, it's not too late. Please feel free to type it into the Q&A box below, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible. The first question I would like to ask Mr. Philip Gass. Okay, so COVID-19 had a significant impact on economies, but it also prompted substantial global recovery packages. What have been the outcomes of these measures, and what is the current situation today?
It's a good question. I think we did see a lot of injection of public revenue to support employment and other initiatives during the COVID period. There were a number of subsidies. IISD has done some work on sort of which subsidies perpetuated fossil fuel development and which ones supported clean energy transition. And the way I would categorize it is that it was the largest amount of investment in clean energy transition that we've ever seen, but also a very large investment in the entrenchment of fossil fuel infrastructure as well. So it was a mix of subsidies for fossil fuels and subsidies for clean energy. I think since then we've seen a number of crises around the world with regards to energy pricing, but also global conflict. And I think we do see that green transition is built into things like reconstruction and recovery, but there is still a good deal of entrenchment of the fossil fuel energy sector as well. I think it's a work that's ongoing. I think as we are moving into a bit more of a geopolitically unstable world in a number of areas, and certainly the pullback of USAID, which was a major funder of development and climate work and human rights and a number of other things, does create a degree of instability in some of these areas. It's going to be a challenging time. I think we need to be very careful about how we invest public funds in the area of the energy sector, and our focus would be not to put in place subsidies for fossil fuels that perpetuate the current system and perhaps can make transition a longer rather than shorter term initiative. And we need to make sure that every public dollar used, be it domestic spending or ODA, really does support an inclusive energy transition, because otherwise we use up these resources that we could use to support transition just to entrench the current system.
Absolutely. I agree that we need to include just transition in funding. Now, my next question would be to Ms. Alice Vodza. The question is, achieving a just transition appears to require substantial resources. What mechanisms are currently in place to support least developed countries in this process?
Thank you. Yes, so there are contexts of negotiations at the global level, and there are international mechanisms that are discussing how important it is to support different countries. First of all, there is always the principle that comes from the Paris Agreement of different responsibilities and differentiated responsibilities and capabilities that we have across the countries. So in the framework of international cooperation, it's important to follow the discussion that happens in the global negotiation spaces. I know that in our context, we work specifically with specific projects that address less developed countries in the form of, the projects that have most interest and support are in the context of natural-based solution. And I was seeing also there was a question from Bangladesh also related to this topic, that are often looking at how to utilize large employment investment programs into opportunities for creating resilience through locally designed natural-based solutions that are supporting restoration of local assets. I think an increasing agenda that requires and deserves more attention is in the context of adaptation. I think perhaps over the past decades, the attention has been largely on mitigation, and the global discussion and funding mechanisms have been focusing on mitigation, like reducing emissions, which is not really the priority agenda for least developed countries. So I think there is at least from our organizational perspective, a closer look now at how to support adaptation measures and funding through responses to specific vulnerabilities and building resilience. So increasing attention onto adaptation agenda, which is not only focused on responding to future emergencies and shocks, but really a transformative agenda that can build local resilience and better and more sustainable economic opportunities in the context of protection of environmental assets. Social protection is also gaining a lot of attention as a measure that, if combined with active labor market policies, can really support advancing agendas and topics that are of critical importance for least developed countries. And then there are, of course, specific funding, climate funding, that are targeted more to least developed countries or to island states or to countries that are more vulnerable and exposed to the impact of climate change. So I think it's important to tap on these opportunities, but also, as we said before, to consider that investing in just transition is not only from the point of view of reducing emissions, but having a better management of the natural capital and natural assets that countries have through adaptation and resilience.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all your answers. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end, so we will have to conclude here as we are running out of time. A heartfelt thank you to our panelists for sharing their expertise and insights, and all of you at home for your engagement throughout the session. You will now see a QR code on the screen. We'd be grateful if you could take a moment to scan it and complete our short feedback survey. Your inputs would help us improve and continue offering impactful, engaging webinars. Feel free to leave us any comments or suggestions. We would love to hear your thoughts. If you would like to stay in touch or learn more about Jeff and our activities, please feel free to visit our website. Should you have any further questions, you are more than welcome to contact us by email at info@jeff.foundation. Thank you once again for being with us today. I wish you all a wonderful day and goodbye.